Qualitative news analysis showing on Newsfile, we put Ghana first. Now, in our first segment, as I told you, we're going to examine the usefulness or otherwise of commissions of inquiry. I'm sure you've been following the sole commissioner that is probing inordinate judgment debts. You certainly, presently, are also witnessing the revelations, absurd revelations that are coming out of the Justice Prempeh Commission, including the very latest one that Ghana paid a man, an Angolan agent, up to 20,000 United States dollars. And this was not paid once, it was paid in bits, accumulating to that much. He led the team to a market in Brazil, was paid, is it 10% of whatever it is that they had to shop. The next day, he leads them to the same market and gets paid. It doesn't end there. He leads them again, how many times, to the same place and gets paid. The commissioners are upset. Well, Professor Prempeh is equally upset about that revelation. But can we look beyond being upset? And all of us shouting, and I'm privileged, very excited to be welcoming Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh into the studios. He is a professor of law at Seton Hall Law School, the United States of America. He's specialized in constitutional law, comparative constitutional design, and problems of constitutionalism in post-authoritarian societies. I have encountered him. He makes the law basic, ordinary English. Good morning and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Samson, and thanks for having me.
Great. Now, you've been around, and I've been surprised that even as I follow you on social media, you seem to be giving out premium, platinum consultation, legal consultation for free. Why would you be doing such a thing?
I hope that is true, actually. I think I'm interested basically in trying to demystify the law. I think the law is too important for it to be a monopoly of any professional class.
Right.
I know that there are lawyers who must represent clients in cases or in transactions, and I have done that a good portion of my life as a lawyer. But I also think that we are at a stage in our life as a country where we need to actually open up the public discourse and instead of closing it up. I see more and more, and it may be a good thing, but I think I don't have a particular opinion about that. I see more and more that our public discourse is, a lot of lawyers are entering the public discourse. That's fine. But in a way, it's also shutting out a lot of other voices that people think, well, this is a legal matter, and therefore I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have an intelligent opinion to have. And I think that that actually is not helpful for our democracy. I think it's important that we demystify the law, we speak in plain English, and open up the discourse, because there are multiple voices out there. Law tends to cast issues in, especially in the common law tradition, in binary terms. Plaintiff, defendant, petitioner, respondent, one side versus the other, only two parties. Sometimes there are actually multiple views on an issue. And I think when we box ourselves into the legal prism, into the legal framework, it tends to create these kinds of binary ways of looking at issues, as well as also make them unnecessarily adversarial. Right? Because as lawyers, you know us, we have to, there's no draw in the case. Somebody has to lose, somebody has to win. And we take that into our public discourse, and it tends to polarize the public discourse. So I think that is important. And what I've been trying to do on social media is really trying to just speak like an ordinary person, speak to legal issues like an ordinary person, which is what we are first and foremost before we become lawyers. Right? So I think that's what I'm trying to do.
Starting off on a bit of a general point, and I'm going to quote you. You say, Ghana is rotting to the bone. And you ask, what more do we need to see or know to appreciate this inescapable fact? How do you come to this conclusion, this damning verdicts of your beloved country?
Well, I come to this conclusion with a very keen understanding and study of our history. I mean, in your introduction, you talked about the Judgment Debt Commission, and then you of course talked about the World Cup Commission. We've been having commissions of inquiry before independence, right? The very first corruption scandal that broke was in the 50s prior to independence, and we set up our first commission. We've been doing these rituals many, many times since then. Upon the overthrow of every regime, it used to be the ritual would be to set up many, many commissions of inquiry to probe into all kinds of matters, right? And I think that the fact that we're still here, even after the Judgment Debt Commission, even after all the things with the 50th Anniversary Commission, right? Ghana 50 Commission, we are still having commissions of inquiry going over roughly the same kinds of malfeasance, right? So when I say that Ghana is rotten to the bone, I'm trying to say that our problems are not moral, as in one person is bad, one person is good. These are not offender-specific problems, right? These are not official-specific problems. These are structural problems, systemic problems. That's why they keep recurring. And I think that my disappointment is that we have not used the occasion of commissions of inquiry to actually make structural institutional reform. We've only used them to parade the offender of the day. The favorite offender of the day is paraded before the commission. It's a nice public spectacle. And then once it is over, we retreat. Normally when you do commissions of inquiry, the idea is that you would find certain facts which will expose various things. It might expose the culpability of individuals, but beyond that, because if it was just about the culpability of individuals, then we should give them to the police to do the investigations and prosecute them.
Right.
So the real reason we do commissions of inquiry is not just to establish the culpability of individuals, it's to find what kinds of enablers in the system, what kinds of structural, systemic, institutional enablers allowed this sort of malfeasance or scandal to happen and fester.
You say that we should be able to go beyond the episodic expressions of moral outrage and look to what you just started speaking about, structural changes. But the revelations that come out of commission of inquiry are helpful to the nation. We get to, there's a lot of expose, and we get to know how you are able to come to this conclusion, that how rotting some of the stuff, are.
I think it's I agree. I mean, there's certainly a value, right? There's a social value to doing these things. One of the advantages of a commission of inquiry as opposed to, say, a police investigation is the transparency. Okay. It's public. We all hear it. But when you say that these revelations are the things that prompt us to want to change things, I doubt it, because actually knowledge of these things is quite pervasive. We know what goes on in public life. The revelations upset us, but the knowledge is there. We know the lives that our public officials live. We know them before they enter public office. We know them after they enter public office. We see the change, right? And so I think, like the key proverb says, or saying is time. More or less, I think our outrage is because this has been thrown into our faces and we see the ugliness. But we know that this stuff is ugly, right? Except that when we don't see the ugliness, it doesn't look ugly, right? It doesn't look ugly. So I think that really it's important. I'm not saying these things are not important, but I'm saying that beyond, this is why I call it episodic, beyond these kinds of revelations, it's really what do we do with the information we gather, right? What, for example, after the Ghana 50 probe, right? We said, well, you couldn't prosecute these people. What institutional reform did we make in our public financial management system, for example?
So that first of all, you agree with Justice Samuel Mafosa's opinion in the Ghana at 50, process, when Dr. Charles Rekubrobe and Kojom Piening, Dr. Charles Rekubrobe was the secretary of the Secretariat of the Ghana at 50, and Kojom Piening was chairman of the committee that put all that stuff together. And after the commission, Justice Dossey's commission, set up by President Mills, finished its work, the Attorney General went to court on 2 counts of causing financial loss to the state, is it? And they challenged the jurisdiction of the courts to hold them to account on the basis. and the court came up with a verdict that said that they could not be tried. And he gave this advice. That's what I'm asking, and you suggest that you agree with him. He said that, and I'm quoting him, that what the findings and the holdings in this ruling show is that if government's intention is to prosecute public officers who are alleged to have conducted themselves in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the state in their public duties, the way to go is not the use of commission of inquiry under Article 278 of the Constitution, because of the constitutional history behind the establishment of such presidential commissions under our Constitution. And then he didn't end there. He said, the intention requires, that intention, if we want to prosecute, requires government to use the traditional investigative agencies under our laws so that the Attorney General could report to the powers granted, resort to the powers granted here under Article 88 of the 1992 Constitution to mount the appropriate criminal proceedings if necessary. You say this is how we ought to go?
I am not exactly saying that.
Okay.
I think that whatever interpretation, the very broad, I have read a lot of different views of this opinion. I think we've put too broad a reading on it. And if that's what the judge actually intended, if this broad reading is what he intended, I think it's actually an overreach. Because it's been read to mean, for example, mainly that if you appeared before a commission of inquiry on a matter that touches on criminality, and then you could not, to the extent that you've appeared before the commission and been compelled to give testimony, that you could not subsequently be prosecuted. Well, I think that actually reaches too broadly.
Okay.
Right? The principle, and we saw it in the recent case in South Africa about the recent murder trial.
Okay.
There was one witness who appeared who gave testimony against the defendant, right? Oscar Pistorius or whoever that guy was, right? And that guy's testimony, the court, in the court final judgment, made comments on the guy's testimony because the testimony could also implicate him in a certain crime. So the court said some of his testimony was truthful and therefore helpful to the court, and that part of the testimony that was truthful and helpful but tended to implicate that guy could not be used against him. But other testimony that the court didn't find truthful, right, the court is free. I mean, the idea is that when you appear before a commission of inquiry, you are supposed to help the commission in its fact-finding. If you give truthful evidence before the commission, and that evidence also implicates you in something that is criminal, then the idea is that that testimony, that specific testimony, which you were compelled to give, could not subsequently be used against you, because to use it against you will be to violate your rights, not to be made to incriminate yourself. Right. So it's use testimony. It's not, it's use immunity is what's called. It's not personal immunity that you, your person, cannot be prosecuted at all. It's just that the testimony that you gave cannot be used, but other testimony that you didn't give, that is independently established by the criminal investigation apparatus of the state, could be used against you. Secondly, if the information you gave before the commission was not truthful, then in fact you didn't aid the commission at all, and therefore if the commission established the truth some other way, then you don't get immunity. At least that's the practice in the jurisdiction I'm familiar with. That's where this idea originated. So the new kind of rich, very broad reading that we've put to it, that once you have appeared, it immunizes you, creates a dangerous precedent in my view, because then it means that governments then have an incentive to channel what would ordinarily be criminal matters for the police and the AG's office into commissions of inquiry as a way of immunizing and therefore protecting their own.
I see.
So I really think that we need to go back to this opinion and read it again in the light of the policy behind it. The policy behind it is you've helped us truthfully establish certain facts. You were compelled to give that evidence. If we use it against you, there will be a disincentive in future for people to come to us to testify.
Right.
And therefore we would not.
Some say
right?
that, in fact, that judgment, it's also mainly because the constitutional instrument itself indemnified the witnesses who were appearing against criminal, liability after the process. But let's now talk about what you say ought to be done, which ought to be the right thing. What should we be doing instead of resorting to the commissions?
Well, I mean, the commissions are helpful only to the extent that we're not focused too much on personal culpability of particular individuals, right? The commissions are helpful in giving us a sense of the systemic failures that enable certain things to happen, right? Why a state, a republic, 50-plus-year-old republic, should be run almost like some apampam store, right? We are running this republic like some mom-and-pop store. Even mom-and-pop stores actually get receipts when they purchase things, right? They do certain things properly because it's their own money they are risking. So they do certain things properly. But when you listen to the revelations...
Is this a fair statement?
I think it's fair. When you listen to the revelations, you find that there's something deeply dysfunctional about the way in which this state is run, especially about the way in which the monies that are in the public, are entrusted to these public officials is actually taken care of. It's just embarrassing, actually. I think nationally, it's embarrassing that, there are other non-nationals sitting here listening to these things and wondering who are these people. I mean, why do we run this is a republic, for goodness sake, right? How do you run it this way? It's not, and you also get the sense that there is almost very little understanding or appreciation of conflicts of interest. You see a number of these people being paraded have all kinds of relationships with public officials. How did it get to this point that this kind of very incestuous relationship is going on? So what, for me, it says is that if we use commissions of inquiry, we should learn lessons that would have implications for institutional reform, for legal reform, for, legislative reform, even sometimes for constitutional reform. Those are the things we should be getting out of these commissions. And it's because we don't do it that way, because we do this as moral crusades in which we parade one offender of the day after the other, it becomes a spectacle, and once it goes, you see the same problems occurring. Because some of these things, we've heard some of these things in the Judgment Debt Commission, right, where a whole Attorney General's department comes and says, well, the file for this thing could be in Kumasi, it could be here, we don't even know. This is a government legal department. Can't find files for mega-dollar transactions. That's, so after that, what do? If after that you don't fix the loopholes, if after that you don't take a very holistic, comprehensive view of the structure of the state and say, okay, these are the things that allow these problems to fester, and you focus just on individual malfeasance, then we're not going to solve anything. And I think that's what, unfortunately, we've been using commissions of inquiry for, is just to use these offender of the day parades. They come and go, and at the end of the day, nothing happens, which is why I asked. In that case, you then still should not be here to support, that vehicle, commissions of inquiry, for any purpose. No, in that case, what we then have to do is begin to use them differently, is begin to get the reports of commissions of inquiry to lay out, in addition to the findings, what systemic failures, what structural failures, what legal loopholes were observed by the commissioners, which enable these things to fester, and maybe recommendations on how to close them. So that if it happens, if these things come with no reform, if after the Judgment Debt Commission, all we learn is who did what, is the who, right? If it's all about who, then I'm not particularly interested in it. Then we should give it to the police and the AG's department to do this as a criminal investigation. But if it's about the what happened, the why it happened, then I'm interested in commissions of inquiry, because they do actually provide us with valuable information that we can use to reform the state and how it operates, but not just to point fingers at one or two individuals and then let them off.
If I say their outcomes are often not any different from the Auditor General's report, what would you say?
In a sense, you are correct. In a sense, and that's one big source of disappointment, because the Auditor General's report is ordinarily a public document, right? And in fact, sometimes it takes the graphic to even report a matter in the Auditor General's report before we know that it's there.
Right.
Nobody takes the trouble to read it, to figure out what's going on. But if you read the Auditor General's report, I mean, you will be just amazed at how much money we lose in our MDAs through all the, it's there all the time, year in, year out.
So why don't we stick to that point where you suggest that we take the Auditor General's report and we prosecute anybody who is culpable?
I think that's one option. I think definitely we need to begin to think differently about the Auditor General's report. That is not just a report you tender to the Public Accounts Committee. They hold some hearings here and there with some drama and some humor, and then we don't know what happens because of what Parliament can't order prosecution in these kind of cases. If we made it a rule, if we had the Attorney General bound and say the Attorney General shall refer matters stemming out findings of illegality and irregularities out of the Auditor General's report, you know, for criminal investigation and possible prosecution, then we give it some legal bite. The way it is now, it's a fine document, tendered to Parliament, discussed, sometimes with some partisan flavor to it, and then forgotten. And we don't know what happens thereafter.
The President recently asked the Attorney General to look into some of those reports and take the necessary steps.
But it should not be left to the say-so of the President or the instruction of the... In fact, it's actually not good practice to have the President tell the Attorney General how to use prosecutorial power. It's not good practice. So rather than have the President order his Attorney General selectively what things to prosecute, right? We should have it as a practice, as a standard practice, that when we get an Auditor General's report and it reveals, or because the Auditor General is not a lawyer, maybe their conclusions about illegality may not be necessarily final, but at least if they raise reasonable doubts, I mean, they raise reasonable suspicion that illegalities have occurred, that the AG should be duty-bound to follow up on them, give it to the police to follow up on the criminal investigation, and then give it to the prosecutors. Yes, I think that we should move to that point where we have, because a lot of these things, you're correct, a lot of these things are actually stated year in, year out in Auditor General's reports. I have no doubt about that, because I've read them and I see them.
So for example, how do you feel? You're looking at the Auditor General's point, for example, and the Auditor General is empowered by law that if he found that someone had, you know, misappropriated some funds, he could surcharge that person. But we never hear that. It goes to the PAC, the Parliamentary Committee, and then, as you said, it ends there, nothing happens.
Yeah, I mean, so essentially, we really need to go. I don't, of course, agree with the view that, oh, all the laws are there, what we need to do is enforce them. In fact, there are lots of gaping holes in our legal system. But for some of them, yes, there are some laws out there. They just need a little bit more practice behind them. Sometimes you may have a law, but if the bureaucratic tradition, the practice in the bureaucracy has been to do things a particular way, then the law may be there, but in fact the practice is different. And we see that a lot even with our Constitution, that sometimes the certain practices are so deeply entrenched in the way in which we run our state that notwithstanding the Constitution, that practice continues to fester. So it's important to really step back and take a very broad view of these things, right? Look at the system, look at it from a system like an engineer would do, like an architect would do. Look at this in a systems way and begin to see how this all fits together to create this mess. Because it's actually different moving parts are causing this thing. It's not just one bad.
Some of those who are watching and listening to us have a question for you. Theophilos is asking, he wants you to tell him what happens to those the commissions that are investigating may find to have done wrong. What happens to them?
Well, it depends on how we read Justice Zamafo's opinion. If we read it to mean, one, if the person appeared before the commission, was compelled to give testimony before the commission, and that testimony is what leads to this person's criminal culpability, our finding that this person is criminally culpable, then in fact, in most jurisdictions, that testimony could not be used against the person. If information came out of the commission about somebody else who didn't appear before the commission, obviously that person can be prosecuted. And if, in my view, if a person appeared before the commission, gave information that was shown not to be truthful, and the commission later on established its own facts, that person should be prosecutable, right? So
for perjury Or just for the other matters?
Well, because they're on oath, yeah, possibly for perjury as well.
Okay.
And usually, you know, I think we need to go back to Justice Marfo's opinion and really open it up a little bit to understand the policy rationale behind it, because you have to understand the underlying policy behind the rule before the rule begins to make sense to you.
What I find most people asking is that, so can the commission itself not ask for anything to be done?
The commission has to make findings and recommendations, absolutely. Right. So, but in the manner in which these commissions are done, when the president establishes under 248, these become more advisory commissions, really, because the government then comes and issues a white paper and decides that we accept this, we don't accept that, you know. So that is also one of the troubling things about using the commission route, because then you leave it to the discretion of the government, the judgment of the government after the fact, to determine what we do with this.
Right.
Right.
I chanced on an old law. I don't know if it's still applicable. It's some an SMC law. So it says that commissions are able to ask for refund, and when they make that recommendation, the Attorney General will simply just straightforward act on it as if it is a judgment of the court, and then go ask them to give the money back.
If there is any such law, I would love it.
Right.
Right. I mean, why not? I mean, recovery. And I also think that sometimes we overuse the criminal law paradigm.
Okay.
Right? Many things, not everything that is bad needs to be punished by jail sentence, or, I mean, we sometimes for a country that needs a lot of money, when public officers commit crimes that involve loss of public funds, we should go for recovery of, we could go for restitution. We should get the monies back. It's a more helpful remedy for us as a country than putting the guy in jail and then you have to take care of them in jail and all of that, right? So we should begin to really expand on the range of options, right? Criminal remedy options that are available to a court, to a commission, or to any state agency. Because this simple matter of you are guilty, we punish you, maybe you go to jail, we lose out on both ends. We lose the monies, oftentimes, and we take care of these people in jail, right? So I think recovery of assets, restitution, and those other remedies, criminal sanctions, are, in my view, more helpful in cases like this where people have squandered money, you know, needlessly.
All right, but there's also the school of thought that commissions of inquiry, the actual orientation originally is to get them to help us to find facts that will help us to preempt certain costly, you know, decisions that we would have made.
Precisely.
So we learn from what they bring forward.
Precisely.
But some ask the question, like you have just said, we don't seem to ever learn. So what's the use?
Yeah, I think we have over-moralized these issues, and I think it's yes, there are certain immoral acts in public life. There are certain bad guys, but I think when systemic failures are this rampant and this pervasive, even the good guys get tainted, right? I mean, when the whole barrel is corrupted, it's not just one or two bad apples in it that's bad. I mean, when you throw even the good apple in it, that barrel contaminates it. So I think we should, not that we shouldn't pass moral judgment, right? But we should actually do the moralizing less and think more systemically and structurally about these problems, right? That the system itself is deeply flawed. And the more and more good people we throw into it, the more and more good people we waste and we turn into bad people. We don't want to do that, right? So if indeed the system is such that it is inviting not only bad people, but turning even good people into bad, then we have to fix the system itself so that it will be attractive to people who are otherwise quite moral and will do the right thing.
Okay.
Right? But when you leave opportunities too open, the incentives for corruption are so ample in the system that sometimes the supply of the corruption creates its own demand.
Okay. So before you leave us, can you tell us, do you find that there's a need for any constitutional re-engineering about commissions of inquiry or anything like that?
About many things. In my view, I think that we really should take a very much more deeper and more comprehensive view of the workings of our Constitution than we have so far. Constitutions are not a cure-all, but sometimes they create huge incentives they are too permissive. I have described our constitution as one of the most permissive constitutions I've seen. Right? There are very few constraints. What you do with a good constitution is you do two things. You first empower public officials to do their work, so you give them power, right? And as James Madison says, then you turn around and constrain them, because human beings are not angels. Constitutions are not run by angels, they are run by human beings. They are also run not by just any human beings, they are run by politicians who have their own agendas. So when you're making a constitution, you have to factor this kind of context into it and make constitutions that will be run by human beings who are vulnerable, who are tempted, politicians who have agendas different from the public interest, so that you don't leave gaping loopholes and all these permissive omissions and others in there for people to take advantage of.
So that's specifically what you see that ought to be done with the Shraj Commission, for example, the Commission on Human Rights.
Shraj, I would do a whole lot with Shraj.
Yes.
We don't have.
If you can just quickly run us through one or two points.
I think Shraj, I would definitely separate out Shraj's 3 mandates. Right, Shraj is a Human Rights Commission. It does administrative justice and it's supposed to do anti-corruption. And the danger there is that when you don't adequately resource it to do all 3, even if you do, once it's doing one or the other well, you cannot say that it is not doing its work. Okay. So, for example, I wasn't surprised, because I've said it before, when the Shraj Commissioner was asked about, what about anti-corruption? He said, but we're doing 99% of our work in human rights. Now, that's a true statement. Because, once they are doing human rights, can you say they're not doing their work? That's part of their mandate. So if you want them to do corruption, create a separate anti-corruption commission. If the anti-corruption commission doesn't do corruption work, we know they are not doing their work. They can't come and tell us, oh, because we are doing human rights or administrative justice.
So it should be an outfit under the commission?
No. I think we need a separate human rights commission doing administrative justice and human rights, and a separate anti-corruption if we want corruption to be fought that way. Then the mode of appointment, the mode of nomination, the tenure of these things, we don't, for example, need to link everything to the Court of Appeals judges. Why? I mean, part of the problem we created with this rent and housing business, right, is that you have a system where once you create an independent public office holder, you think it must be linked to the Court of Appeal, the terms of the Court of Appeal judge, which means if Court of Appeal judges are getting houses and are getting, they must also get all of them.
All right.
Why do we have to do that? There are many different ways in which you can give independence to a commission without linking it to the judiciary. We should begin to link the two and do something about mode of appointment. We should make it bipartisan. We should make it by a supermajority of Parliament. Parliament must approve it, but not by a simple majority. In South Africa, there's a job called a public protector. It's the equivalent of our Shraj. That person is appointed, is nominated by a committee of Parliament that is represented proportionally by all parties in Parliament. And once they've done that, Parliament must approve it by 60%. Okay. If we did that in Ghana, we will get some people who don't think that they owe their job to a particular party. Okay. Right? So some of these things are constitutional, and we have to look at the Constitution again, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh, Professor of Law, and he's been assisting us to look at the commissions of inquiry and their usefulness, and what we can do with what they are able to come out with. Thank you very much for honoring our invitation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Good to see you again.
Thanks indeed. Now, don't go anywhere. My guests, other guests are going to come in, and these same matters will be delved into deeper. And I have Prof's write-ups, some of his suggestions. I'll throw some of them at some of my guests, and we see how we can provide, a better platform for the better development of our country. We'll be right back after this break.